A few weeks ago, Ellen of SP Books, Saint Pierre Books, contacted us to say that they had produced a new facsimile of the Rossetti Manuscript, which is Blake's notebook with Rossetti's transliterations, comments, in collaboration with the British Library. First of all, the Blake curator at the British Library is going to speak to us in a special 5-minute recording, and she will introduce herself in that. Then I'm very happy to say that our two excellent trustees, Tamsin Rosewell and John Riordan, are going to tell us and talk about this beautiful new artifact, which is still available with a special Blake Society discount. If there's time, there will be the opportunity to ask questions after the event, in which case you can switch your cameras on. And this will all happen after their presentation.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Alt, Lead Curator of Manuscripts 1601 to 1850 at the British Library. Thank you so much for inviting me to give a brief introduction to the William Blake manuscripts we hold at the British Library, which includes the Manuscript Notebook of Blake. One of the reasons we're here this evening is to celebrate the new publication of a facsimile of the notebook by Edition de Son Père. I'd like to start by saying what a wonderful book this is and how pleased I was to see a copy last week. I know John Lee, our head of publishing at the British Library, is equally delighted with this publication. Material by and relating to William Blake is spread around a large number of institutions across the world, but we're lucky enough to have some really incredible examples here at the British Library. The Notebook of William Blake is arguably one of the most important items in the whole of the library's holdings of over 170 million objects. It's what we call a treasure, and as such, as curators, it's our duty to make it both accessible and to preserve it for generations to come. The notebook itself is a mixture of pencil and ink on paper and wash, and many of the pages have been interleaved with a protective sheet so as to prevent the pencil from rubbing further. The notebook, although fragile, is in remarkably good condition, considering Blake used it for such a long period of time. Subsequently, its later owners, including most famously Rossetti, clearly engaged quite significantly with it, including adding his own notes to the back of the volume. The last time the notebook was displayed was at Tate Britain, the Rossetti's Radical Romantics in 2023. Prior to that, it went to major Blake exhibitions at the Ashmolean in 2015 and the Metropolitan Museum in New York and Tate Britain in London in 2020. Once off display, our conservation teams advised a significant rest period. My favourite page in the notebook is the one which contains the drafts for the poem London. It's a poem that I return to time and time again, and I always marvel how it forces the reader down dark, narrow and unfriendly streets in London, and for this reason I find it a very physical poem. In this draft, Blake has changed a number of the lines, such as, "In every infant's cry of fear" was originally, "In every voice of every child." Another verse was going to begin, "But most through midnight harlot's curse," but which became the second line, starting, "But most through wintry street I hear how the midnight harlot's curse." This page also contains drafts for the poem The Tiger, and on the following slide I've highlighted where the drafts sit. In the upper left and central squares are the drafts for London, and the lower right square is for The Tiger, and you can clearly see how Blake has scribbled out and rewritten a number of lines. Other important objects in the manuscripts collection at the British Library is the draft for Tyriel, shown here, and Valor or the Four Zoas, and this is folio 2 here. And we're in the process of preparing folio 2 of the Four Zoas to go on display in the touring exhibition Writers Revealed from 2025, April, at the Home of the Arts on the Gold Coast in Australia. And it will be displayed with Thomas Phillips' portrait of Blake from the National Portrait Gallery collections. And whenever I look at Blake's manuscripts, I always discover something new. And when our manuscripts conservator and I were assessing folio 2 of Valor or the Four Zoas for display, We noticed in particular that Blake was using scratching or scrubbing out, in some cases to delete lines of text which he rewrote, but in others for artistic effect. And you can actually see this on the verso of folio 2, with a light shining through it in the centre here. The Four Zoas folio 2 is also being displayed with a letter by Blake to John Trussler. And among the letters we have by Blake in British Library collections, I selected this particular one because it contains the quote, "I see everything I paint in this world," which matches very well with the rapt expression Phillips captured on the face of Blake in the portrait. In addition to manuscripts and letters by Blake, the library also holds a number of important printed objects which can be found on the online catalogue at www.bl.uk. And despite the numerous ongoing interest in Blake, I feel there is so much more to discover, and I'm excited to see what the future of Blake research holds. So I'm going to end this brief introduction here and say thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the British Library's incredible collection of William Blake manuscripts. And if you've got any questions, please do not hesitate to send me an email, the details of which are on this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Alexandra. That was really interesting. My colleague John Riordan and I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the Rossetti Manuscript because we're both working professional illustrators. We both have, such documents, little notebooks and sketchbooks and things, and we use them very often. And John, as I'm going to ask him to talk about a little bit, has actually been working on a biography, a comic biography of Blake. Sorry, comic as in artwork, not as in he hasn't made it humorous. At least
it has its moments,
Oh, it has its moments, but
yeah.
But we just thought it would be interesting, rather than going into the deep analysis of the document and what's in it, if we actually looked at it both as illustrators. John, do you want to start by just talking a little bit about its provenance? Because I know that's of interest and importance to you.
Yeah, sure. Just before I do, I just want to say two qualifying things. One, despite having been completely fine all day, my internet just went weird and kicked me out of Zoom. So if I do disappear, that's why.
I'll just keep talking.
Tamsin, yeah, it seems very good for both of us doing it. The other thing is I'm recovering from a cold, so if I sound croaky and if I make any less sense than usual, that's what I'm blaming it on. Yeah, we thought it was worth, just for people who haven't had a chance to look at this fancy new edition, or indeed any facsimile of the notebook, to talk a little bit about what it is and its history, and also just very briefly kind of cover what's in it. So I think the first thing that's worth saying is that it seems that it was originally the notebook and sketchbook of Blake's brother, his beloved younger brother, Robert. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that he held on to it, and, as we'll see, sort of obsessively went back and reused and reworked stuff in it. I think it probably held a very sort of sentimental importance to him, because, in case you don't know, his brother died, I think he was only 25, something like that, in, let me get it right, 1787, I think. And it looks like the notebook then went to William. And there are some drawings in the notebook early on that the sort of general consensus is that they're actually sketches by Robert. They look very Blakean, but perhaps don't quite have the kind of finesse and the that real sort of the same ability, I suppose. So William went on to use it after that. And shall we have the next slide, actually, Anise, if that's possible? Because it sort of gives you an idea. What I love about the notebook is how scribbly and all things going on from all different kind of periods there are. So we can see those sort of rectangular bordered off drawings in the middle of the 2 pages there. And it looks like the first thing that Blake used the notebook for was to draw these pencil emblems. And it was definitely kind of conceived as a series, and these went on to be kind of boiled down into the images. I think there are 17 of them that are in the Gates of Paradise, that he published twice in sort of two different versions. And then later on, as we saw in the video we just saw, a lot of the drafts and kind of working out of the versions of particularly the songs of experience are in the notebook. And one of the other things I love about the notebook is he got to the end and literally turned it over and started again from the back. So most of the songs of experience stuff is all upside down, which you'll see if you see the facsimile. It's all like about a third of it's upside down. It's brilliant. And he then went on to kind of keep on going back over decades, really, to kind of add all this fantastically spidery bits of writing. Some of the other sort of significant things that are in there, there's these fantastically bitchy poems that he writes when he about people like Haley and Flaxman and Cromek, sort of friends and acquaintances and enemies who he was sort of working out his pretty kind of vituperative feelings about at times. He then there's the public address, which is his kind of prose thing, which is his sort of cranky art criticism thing. And then probably the other sort of big significant things are a vision of the Last Judgment and the everlasting gospel. So after William's death in 1827, the notebook was given by his wife Catherine to Samuel Palmer's brother, another William. And it was him who, I think about 20 years later, sold it to Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who I think was about 19 at the time. Is that right?
Yeah, he was very young. He was
Yeah.
a young up and coming poet and an artist.
Yeah. I should say as well, so the other thing Tamsin and I have done is we've gone through the notebook and selected a few pages, kind of to use as illustrations, really, to we sort of worked out the topics we want to cover. So this is one of the first that I chose, and I really chose it as a good example of that real kind of palimpsest nature of the notebook. So you can see again, there's that kind of squared off emblem, which would have been the earliest thing to be drawn on that page. And then there's that fantastic profile self-portrait of Blake himself, which looks to me like it was probably done in his 50s, something like that. So again, you can see he's kind of gone back decades later to draw that self-portrait. On the left of that page, you can just see written vertically, I forget exactly what it says, 1810 sometimes. I think it says found the word golden. So again, this notebook is just this sort of brilliant, it's almost like a kind of external brain where he's just working things out, and literally it's kind of a memoir and it's a sketchbook and it's working out his poems, and it's all just there on the page. And the other stuff on this page, I think, is all the kind of art crit stuff from the public address, which is him kind of giving a good kicking to Joshua Reynolds and what he thinks is wrong with the British art scene. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Do you want to pick that up?
Should we move on? Because I think one of the things that John and I talked about together quite a
Mhm.
bit was how we should be looking at this notebook. It was very clearly a private document for Blake. It was kept on his person, probably pretty much for all of his adult life after his brother's death. And it is, as my notebooks are, they're full not only of my own thoughts and scribbles, but jottings down of quotes from other people, other writers and things, and that we find in here as well. So given that, I don't know, we both felt, I think, that it was perhaps not very helpful to have this, a constant, academic analysis of it. Is that appropriate? And the image that we've chosen as an example of that is this one here that's on the screen. I had a really interesting, lovely exchange with an academic in Germany that Sibylla, our chair, introduced me to about this, because it looks, I'd be really curious if you put into the message, into the chat box, of what other people think is going on here. But this has been variously interpreted. I've noticed in the introduction to this new facsimile, they've interpreted this as a woman sitting semi-dressed on the side of the bed and a man in bed, perhaps with a hat on of some kind, who's sort of just awake and perhaps talking to her. But this hasn't always been interpreted like that. I think, in previous biographies and in previous analysis, it's been interpreted as the other way round, that it's actually a man who's sitting on the side of the bed. He too would have been wearing stockings at the time in a state of semi-undress, and that it's a woman who's lying in the bed. And indeed, the hat that she's wearing does look more like a woman's bonnet than a man's. And if it's a woman sitting on the side of the bed, why is there no discarded corset, for example? So, and then John, do you want to talk about what's written underneath? Because it might not have anything to do with.
Yeah, this is the thing. This is, yeah. So I mean, first I just like to say it's such a lovely drawing. It's just like a really brilliant characterful drawing. But as Tamsin says, there's long been this sort of assumption, which maybe is not even necessarily well founded, that is the Blakes, that is William and Catherine, one way round or another. And it is almost like an optical illusion. It's like if you look at it going, oh yeah, it's a woman on the left, then you see a woman on the left. If you look at it as going, oh, that's the man, or possibly William, you see it like that way. It's really strange. And then as Tamsin says, there's this added aspect to it, that the text below, I mean, it's quite hard to make out a lot of Blake's scribbled handwriting. But what that says, got it written down, is when a man has married a wife, he finds out whether her knees and elbows are only glued together. So it's this slightly risque aphorism. The temptation, obviously, is to read that, as many people have done, many biographers and scholars, in conjunction with that image, that it's a comment that they're meant to go together, that it's about, the marriage bed, and that it is some sort of comment of dissatisfaction, or a comment on the Blake's marriage itself. Who knows? I don't know nearly enough about this today, whether there's any reason to suppose that text was even written at the same time as that drawing. They're clearly, one's in pencil and one's in pen. So it's very seductive to want to and as someone, as Tamsin says, who is currently working on a project which is a graphic novel based on the life of William Blake, you want to kind of read these things into it. But I think it is dangerous, perhaps, to make some of these assumptions.
I agree. I think as well that there have been various comparisons about whether this is not Blake's own parody of Rowlandson, or other cartoonists at the time. And there are indeed a couple of images that in which the figures are in very, very similar positions. There's one notable image called "The Old Maid and the Fly," which is quite interesting. Which she's sweet. She's in exactly the same position as the figure seated on the bed. It's a woman, but she does have it's clearly a woman, and she has her corset discarded on the floor. And what she's doing with her hand is swatting a fly away from her stocking, but simultaneously commending the fly to going where no man has ever dared to go. So, whether it's a satirical comment on something, another dialogue that was going on at the time in comic art is also. So in some ways, is it helpful if we do this analysis? Is it unhelpful? I mean, it's fun, but I'm not sure.
Jody Amali has just put in the comments, what if it's two men or two women, etc., which again just goes to show you sort of make these assumptions based on your biographical reading, or your assumptions about the history of the scenario. But quite.
Joe, can I just take the opportunity, John, can you just tell us a bit more about that graphic novel? Because I think a lot of
I've even got
newsletter.
I can never remember. Does it show the right way? I don't know. So this is sort of work in progress that some people have seen. And it's very much work in progress. It's early days, but this is the idea is it's going to be a graphic novel that kind of follows the life of William Blake. So it's involving lots and lots of research, and it's great fun. But it's I think one of the reasons that I love Blake anyway is that him and want to do his life is the idea that of seeing working out what from his life went into the art and that sort of transformative process. So I think, again, that's something that's really lovely about the notebook, is to see the kind of crucible from which some of these things emerge. Yeah. Yeah.
So should we move on a slide?
We have the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, and then actually
Yeah.
just talk about, again, John and I chatted quite a lot about the sort of the purpose of this. And I don't, working in the book industry now, I think that there is a growing fashion for putting on a pedestal and idolizing artists or illustrators' sketchbooks. And I'm kind of, in fact, there are new awards out for, you know, the artist sketchbook, you know, a living working art illustrator's sketchbook. There's a new award for this. And I just feel really strongly that while it's interesting, the moment you start to think about your sketchbook as something that you would like to use to showcase your work and to present to people, and perhaps you might be up for an award for it, it does become something slightly different. And I think it's really worth, you know, while these you know, these facsimiles are absolutely beautiful and really helpful, I'm delighted to have it, I also think that we need to acknowledge that this is something different. This isn't something that was ever intended to be published, of Blake's, you know, unlike a lot of what's going on now. In fact, you know, the Martin Salisbury published an entire book about art illustrators' sketchbooks. So, you know, there's a real spotlight shining on them in our own time. But there's a kind of voyeurism, was the word I used, John. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I agree. It's weird, isn't it? Because you feel like you're drawing back the curtain and getting to see a bit more of the creative process, but without the permission of the artist. Again, you sort of wonder on the assumptions you're making about how these things came together, and also what has and hasn't survived. I mean, it's interesting that the reason we have this sketchbook is that Catherine Blake gave it to William Palmer, and a lot of the Blake material ended up going to Frederick Tatum, boo hiss, who in a sort of had joined some kind of cult, I think, hadn't he, and decided there were aspects of Blake that were satanic and apparently destroyed quite a lot of his material. So presumably there were other notebooks and other sketchbooks, but you know, this is the one that's come down to us. The reason I wanted to chose this page as well was partially just because the quality of the drawing, the kind of beautiful drawing, and it's the first the sketch version of the traveller hasteth in the evening, which both in this version and in the final version in Gates of Paradise is just such a beautiful, iconic image. But also, as some of you have probably noticed, the traveller seems to have stopped to have a little piss in the top left-hand corner there. So again, you've got this kind of wonderful kind of unguarded quality because, as Tamsin says, this was not drawn to be seen by anyone, and we've already seen, you know, him writing these kind of rude poems about the marriage bed. There's kind of rude sketches like this. There are other poems, as I said, where he's been really kind of pretty vicious about his contemporaries. There's a really weird poem, which I think is on the first page of the sketchbook, about Klopstock, the German poet, which is, to say the least, quite toilety. So there's all this kind of real kind of raw quality to the notebook, which I love, which you don't see so much in the kind of finished Blake manuscripts, I think.
No, I agree. And actually, you know, if we think again about that image of the couple, you know, sitting, or the two people with the bed, that, you know, the comment under it actually is more likely to be a joke and a comment on somebody else's marriage
Yeah.
that you wouldn't say in public or you wouldn't put into a poem than it was to be anything about his own, if indeed that's what it refers to at all, or something that was going on in the public eye. So we make these assumptions about what's going on, that the things are associated and they're not. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think it's quite important that we talk about the fact that it was Rossetti who purchased this object, and we know that primarily initially because he actually wrote it in the front of the notebook. And what's interesting about this particular facsimile is, do you want to just move on one slide, Anise? because, and I've chosen this page for a particular reason, which I'll go into, but they've published it with Rossetti's annotated versions of, or edited versions of William Blake's poems, which he's transcribed, as it were, from the handwriting, and they've published those at the back, so we can see the direct line from William Blake through to the way that Dante Gabriel Rossetti is using the notebook and
he writes something like I forget exactly the wording, but it's something like everything that is of worth in
yes, exactly, everything is of worth. Blake. And I think that's quite important, because actually what he's doing is he's translating it for the sensibilities of that early Victorian audience. So this particular, the thing that seems to have appealed to Gabriel Rossetti about this notebook was actually noted by his brother, which is that what appealed to the young Rossetti was anything and anyone who appeared to be radical and a dissenter, and who was stepping outside the norms and the confines of their environment. And that's really at the foundation of what the Pre-Raphaelite movement felt, particularly initially, is that what it was about. And on this page, there are various, rude and salacious references to the likes of Reynolds and Titian. And that is very precisely what inspired Gabriel Rossetti to, that it was okay to discard, perhaps, or be critical, openly critical of the teachings of the establishment, and to actually set up and, go and create something else, which is what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood then did, complete with a manifesto and various signatures. And it became bigger than the Brotherhood, eventually. And there was definitely many women involved. I think there's quite a lot more, though, about where this comes in the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And I think it's also worth dropping in that we can see a fairly direct line between this and what Gabriel Rossetti did with it. And then how we see there's a kind of gap in, I suppose, what you might call Blake's scholarship and interest in Blake after this period, and it revives again at the beginning of the 20th century, at the time of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and there's that side of the Romantic movement. And there's actually a very interesting podcast, if you're interested in Tolkien and what happened after this. There's a great podcast on Visionary, which Jason Whittaker and Denise are both on, actually talking about Tolkien, and Blake and Rossetti is mentioned a number of times in that. But there's, throughout all of that, there is the, right up to Tolkien, there's this creation of a British mythology, the idea that Britain needs its own mythology, its landscape needs its own mythology. We see that in Rossetti and the kind of picking up of the Arthurian legends. We see less classical mythology in Blake, but I did notice that in this twice there are images and references to the Greek story of Daphne and Apollo. So he too is referring to that. I'm just going to move on one slide for the moment, because there's another angle into which Blake hits the Pre-Raphaelite movement, which is completely different as far as I can work out. These, he did literally enter it into from two different sources. So while we've got Rossetti being actually very important in, even though he edited it and was criticised for that, in introducing Blake and promoting the idea of Blake and what Blake was creating to a Victorian audience, we've also got this chap called George MacDonald, who is incredibly important in English literature. I think far more important than he's credited for. But he seems to have known Blake through Robert Blair's work. And this image from Robert Blair's The Grave, which Blake illustrated, his son noted was up on his wall for all of his life, that he could remember that his father had this image from Blake's illustrations to Blair, who was a fellow Scottish poet. Up in his study all that time. Indeed, he even created his own book plate based on this image. So this is George MacDonald's own personal book plate, which you can see written on it, which is very clearly a version of the same image from Robert Blair. So, and then we've got George MacDonald going on to become important in the Pre-Raphaelite movement, in that a young Gabriel Rossetti is watching him lecture and sketching him as he lectures, and he's introducing these ideas about the imagination, which we then see full blown when we reach Phantastes, which is, I think, really one of the most important pieces of fiction, I think, in English literature. And then we've got this whole sort of radical and dissent element, which, you know, collides through all of it. We've got the Pre-Raphaelites really stepping away from the establishment, and we've got, you know, Blake very clearly having created his own approach. There's one note that actually really amused me, which was Christina Rossetti. It's not really known whether she actually saw the Blake notebook. I find it pretty impossible to believe that she wouldn't have seen it and known it was there and been able to look through it, as he was very generous with showing it out. But she was rather more straight-laced, should we say, than a lot of the others in the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and incredibly religious. And there's a wonderful note that she makes in her reading diary, which is, she says, the courageous reverence with which one whom a friend was exhibiting prints from the Book of Job, which we know was Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job, avowed herself afraid to look at the representation, which went counter to the second commandment and looked not at it. And we suspect that this friend was actually herself. It was kind of like, on behalf of a friend, I'm not going to say this, which I just thought was quite an interesting observation, that, you know, Blake's, you know, in different ways, they were receiving it in different ways. Do you want to move on a step? John, should we move on a slide?
Yeah, so this segues quite nicely. This was a bit of an accident. This is great into the last page that I chose, which is the sketch of Death's Door. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about the notebook is that it's often the first time you see these emblematic images that go on to just recur through Blake's work. So Death's Door pops up in America, and then obviously in the grave, and just it's one of those that just keeps on coming back. It was obviously and I think that again we're doing the biographical thing, which is perhaps dangerous, but I think the fact that this was Robert's notebook and sketchbook to begin with, a lot of these emblems seem to be very focused on death. That seems to be the kind of thing that links a lot of these initial sketches, the ideas about death and explorations of that. But the other reason we wanted to, I chose this, was we wanted to talk about the notebook as a physical object, both in its original form and as a facsimile. So as you probably will have noticed, there's a bit missing from this page. The top right-hand corner is just gone. And if actually it's sort of more obvious there's an earlier facsimile edition that I've got a copy of, where it's with the sort of reproduction technology of the day. I think it was published in the 70s. It's actually more obvious because you really kind of see the page, the sort of grey of the page, and it's just snipped out. And what Erdmann thinks happened to this page is that that top right-hand corner was snipped out by Rossetti's brother, Michael. Was he called Michael?
William.
Was he also William? Where have I got this written down? Yeah, and William Michael Rossetti, and he apparently wrote a letter to an American scholar called Horace Scudder, saying that he would send him an example of Blake's writing, and Erdmann thinks that's why that's missing. So it's interesting what you were saying, Tamsin, about the art critical stuff, the stuff where it's really laying into Reynolds and what Blake thinks is wrong with the art establishment, being the stuff that Rossetti loved, because at least according to this sort of Erdmann introduction that I read, he thinks that probably that they would have snipped that bit because it hasn't got any poetry on it. It is all from the public address, these bits, and so it's sort of considered to be less valuable. But obviously to us as sort of Blake fans, this looks like some sort of gross vandalism that they've just cut a bit out of the book. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to point out as a sort of on the theme of it as a physical object is you can see those kind of little grey smudges at the corner of the emblem of the Death's Door emblem. So those I think are glue spots. So in some of the sort of notable in lots of the emblems which did make it into Gates of Paradise and some that didn't, they have those little glue spots where he would have put down tracing paper, I think, over those and transferred those to tracing paper as a sort of next stage to transferring those to the copper plates that he was going to engrave with.
That's really interesting. There was a conversation that John and I had about this book and the production of facsimile, which I thought was quite interesting and actually just really identified us as very different sort of illustrators, because I would always prefer to see my work rather than mass produced. I would prefer to see, my ideal I think would be maybe a print run of 200 really specialist, beautiful, perhaps more like what Blake was doing, than see it sort of churned out and in every WH Smith's in the country. But I think you felt quite different. That would be all right. Okay,
Yeah.
From economics and everything, that's what I would like to. But I think you felt quite differently with your.
Yeah, it's interesting because when this came up because we were talking about this, and I don't want to be mean or sort of rain on the parade of this edition because it is so beautiful and it's amazing, but it is a kind of luxury object. It's beautifully produced. It is beautiful, and it is quite expensive. 10% discount, obviously, don't forget that. But it is a sort of luxury item, and I always slightly kind of bristle at sort of luxury art books, and I think it's because I come from the opposite end of things, and I'm a comics guy, so my kind of way into art and literature is, if you like, the sort of pop end of things, where I want it like, I would love it, my work in particular, to be reproduced and to be a faithful portrayal of what's come off my drawing board. But equally, I want it to be cheap and get to as many people as possible. And then when we were talking and thinking about this as well, it actually, to go back to the sort of biographical Blake stuff, I think I'm right in saying that there's a movement in the way that Blake tried to sell his work. If you look at the last sort of decade, say, of his life, when he's still trying to sell his illuminated books, I think I'm right in saying that even though he was very rarely selling them on the whole, the prices that he quotes are much, much higher than a few decades earlier when he's trying to sell the same books. And it seemed like Blake himself was now, presumably to a great deal as a result of the fact that they weren't selling and that he hadn't sort of succeeded. He was trying to sell them, and on occasion did sell them, to a kind of rare manuscript marketplace instead of a sort of cheaply produced, get them out to as many people thing.
It's really interesting. So one of the conversations we have in the book industry is whether the stuff that is truly mass produced, I mean, all those billions of copies of David Walliams' books, for example, actually ultimately those are the ones that end up at the tip, because there's so many of them. It actually decreases their value in a way, even though you could argue, because they're so ubiquitous now, that they're culturally quite important because they're absolutely everywhere. And actually it's quite interesting to have the British Library involved in this and sending us that video, because actually the stuff that has a longevity is ironically often the stuff of which only a very few copies are produced, because they're treasured and they're kept very close and their value is known from the very beginning. I think there's room in the market for both, and I think we're perhaps lucky that we should acknowledge we're lucky in that we're both working in a market where actually there is room for both, and that they're both considered to be valid and valuable approaches. But wouldn't it be nice to pop back in time and go to Blake's house and buy a few copies of I'd like the Jerusalem, if that's okay.
Yeah, when time travel is invented. We've got about 15 minutes left, haven't we? I think we've sort of covered most of the areas we wanted to cover.
Yeah, I think so.
Shall we ask Camilla to join us and see if there are any questions?
Camilla is going to chair the Q&A, aren't you? So, which is great, because she's actually interesting. She's coming at this from the side of, with a great knowledge of Blake and music. And actually one of the things I did note was that both Rossetti and William Blake's work was set to music, not also Blake certainly in his own lifetime because he sang his pieces, but a lot of Rossetti's stuff, Debussy set various pieces of Rossetti's to music, poems of Rossetti's to music fairly early on, probably not quite in his lifetime, but so are there any questions? If you've got questions, you put them into the
or feel free to turn your cameras
yeah,
on.
turn your cameras on,
Raise
people.
a hand, a real hand or a virtual one. Yeah.
No, over to you.
Yeah, but I wanted to say thank you first, Jan and Tamsin, for such a fabulous and interesting talk, which was clearly enriched by background as professional illustrators. And it just makes me even more anxious to get hold of my own copy of the manuscript. As they announced, we have a few minutes for questions and comments, and I would like to invite all the participants to turn your cameras on and to use the raise hand function if you want to say something. And do not forget to unmute yourself before speaking. I have a question myself, but I'll wait a bit and see if others have questions to ask. I'll keep an eye on the chat as well.
I was just going to say as well, as I hope Tamsin and I have made clear, we're sort of approaching this as illustrators and definitely not Blake scholars. So please don't feel like they need to be insightful questions. If you've got a view or an observation, that's equally welcome.
There is a question on the chat, which is what's the relationship of this notebook to what's called the Pickering Manuscript?
I don't know. I can't answer that question at all.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I also don't know much about it. I was thinking about this earlier. I'm thinking, oh yeah, what are the other things that survive the Pickering manuscript? Pickering manuscript has, oh God, I'm blaming my cold that I can't remember the name of anything. The super famous Blake poem, Grain of Sand.
Auguries of Innocence.
Auguries of Innocence. Thank you very much. Is in the Pickering manuscripts originally, I think, isn't it? I think I'm right in saying, but I don't know much about or anything about the provenance of that or how that's come down to us. Perhaps someone else does.
Gareth raised hand. I don't know if it's to answer to this question or to ask another question himself.
It wasn't to answer that one. It was to ask another one. Am I allowed to do that, or are we still on the the provenance of the Pickering manuscript? I'm very pleased that I can admit my ignorance on the Pickering manuscript, along with all these other esteemed people admitting their ignorance. So few. First of all, just another plug for John's fantastic graphic novel of Blake. I said it in the chat, but John, you ought to tell people how to get hold of that again, because I got it just before Christmas, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's one of the most lovely conceptions of Blake's life I've ever seen. So everyone should get a copy. But I wanted to say the Rossetti manuscript looks like kind of just what Blake meant by minute particulars. You know, looks like on every page there's some minute particulars. So I was going to ask each of you, what is your most favorite minute particular from the facsimile of the manuscript?
Right. I think John's internet seems to be a bit dodgy, so I'm going to go first. I'm going to see if I can find it. I think it's probably going to be some of the images that where we can start to see the flames, and that is a very, very beautiful line. As an illustrator, I think about how there's so much character in somebody's line, and if you think about the difference between different illustrators, it's often the fluidity of the line that they use, and how, so whether it's a pretty line or a bold line. I'm just frantically scrolling through it, so I'm going to go with what's page 59, 57 and 30, which is that one that I'm going to hold up to the screen. You probably can't quite see. No, we've got one image which actually looks like part of his drawings of Titania and Oberon. There's one where they're in the lily. But you've got the fluidity of that line, which we also see in all his flames, all those Blakean flames. So I'm going to pick that one out. I don't know if Does anyone else have a copy to hand? They want to, or know it well enough actually even to pick out some words? I'm very much a visual person, but
Oh,
do
dear.
you know the well enough, Gareth, to have a favourite moment in the book?
I don't know. I'm looking forward to knowing it better, but I don't know at the moment. But I will say that your comment on Blake's, what he called his bounding line. I mean, it was so important to him. So I'm delighted that the manuscript sort of speaks to that centrality of his bounding line. Is he's got so much art theory bound up with it. So yeah, that's really good to know. Yeah, thank you, and what a wonderful talk as well. Thank you so much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you. We're waiting to join us again, but we've got another question from Jennifer Jess. So if you can.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have an earlier, the earlier facsimile, 1977 facsimile of this notebook, and I've spent many hours with it and just fascinated by looking at his mind in motion, sense you get from this kind of a text. But as we're sitting here talking about it, I was all of a sudden, for the first time, just struck with horror at the idea of a public viewing, of this personal, this private notebook. And I was wondering, was there any kind of tradition in Blake's day of sharing sketchbooks among artists or sharing them publicly at salons? I know sometimes we look at the annotations as something private, but in fact, many times they were lent to the author in order for that person to annotate them, which those things were meant to be read. But I don't have any idea of how sketchbooks or notebooks like this were treated.
I can kind of partially answer that in terms of how art training might have worked, because it does actually sort of feature as part of this. And Blake and Rossetti both make this criticism. It's more than a criticism. I think it's a kind of broad observation about the nature of when you're copying one of the masters, which is the way this would have been taught at the Royal Academy, which is where the criticism of Reynolds and co comes in, is that actually copying, we all learn by copying, whether you're writing or whether you're imitating somebody who you admire in their speaking style, if you're an academic, or writing style, or drawing, we all imitate. That's how we learn, that's how we find our own way. But beyond that, which is Blake's point, that it is something different. It's not art. Is that really art? If you see a beautiful copy of a Michelangelo, somebody's beautifully drawn a Michelangelo, do we really consider that art, or is that study? And I think that's certainly one of the criticisms that comes across, and it's one of the things that translates into the pre-Raphaelite movement as well, that they want to skip back, was why it's called the pre-Raphaelites. They want to skip back before Raphael. They want to gain back that grain of truth to it. So I would have thought that at the time, an illustrator or an artist's sketchbook would have been very much a learning experience, which is, I think it's a learning experience, anyway. What would have been shared would be the finished piece.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
It doesn't quite answer your question, but hopefully it goes some way.
I don't really know much about
John, we've lost your sound.
Sorry about my internet kicking me out. Can you hear me? I don't know a lot about people sharing sketchbooks, but I'm quietly confident that William wasn't showing this sketchbook to Flaxman or Haley, or because it's pretty nasty stuff. Yeah, I just wanted to, before my internet went rogue and kicked me out, I just wanted to thank Gareth for what he was saying about my work in progress graphic novel. I hope the final plan is for the thing to be much longer and for it to be a sort of to follow William throughout his life. Can I quickly share a minute particular as well? Because I particularly love this page here. because it has this fantastically weird little poem. And I think this is the page the notebook was open at the exhibition at the Ashmolean that Michael Phillips curated in 2015, because the person who I went to the exhibition with, the sadly departed poet Heathcote Williams, who some of you might be aware of or might even have known, spotted this poem and wanted and sort of asked me to find out, because see if he'd read it right with Blake's handwriting. And I think what it says is, to God, if you have formed a circle to go into it yourself and see how you would do. Which is sort of weirdly, again, sort of quite bitchy, but he's having a go at God, but sort of strangely kind of gnomic and mysterious as well. I really like it.
You can see why Christina Rossetti was shocked.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have another question from Diane.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for the talk. It's really fascinating. I don't know the notebook, not in its entirety at all. And so I'm very curious about the comment that Blake carried it with him throughout his life and that he might have had other notebooks. Are there ways of telling from the notebook? Are there does it follow the poems? You know, is there evidence for all of the poems, all of his life in that notebook? So yes. I guess what I'm wondering is, why do people think there's other notebooks? You know, and not just that one?
Yeah, I'm really not a scholar, so this is all sorts of guesswork, really. My assumption is that there must have been other notebooks because of what is in there and what isn't in there, if you see what I mean. So we've got, songs of experience, but there's no songs of innocence, as an example. He wasn't only working poetry out and only working out drawings in this notebook. It just seems it would be really odd to me if he wasn't using other notebooks throughout his life. But the fact that he did keep on coming back to this one, perhaps they were all like that. Perhaps he was going back and drawing over and writing over everything in 10 books. I don't know. But you can definitely sort of follow, to a certain extent, the progress through. You can definitely see, as I said, that when he kind of turns it over and starts writing the songs of experience in upside down for us, because he's literally turned the notebook over. And again, you can sort of see phases, like all of the really kind of stuff where he's obviously in quite feeling quite distressed about and feeling quite hard done by his friends and colleagues, and the stuff where he's really working that stuff, that kind of animosity out, is all seems to sort of come in a certain part of the notebook. So I think to a certain extent you can see him sort of literally working through it again and then going back and finding a bit more space and adding things. Yeah, but it's yeah, as I say, I'm not an expert, but yeah.
I've just noticed there's a comment from Nathan in there about the aesthetic value of sketchbooks, and I think, he was talking about Leonardo's sketchbook about being the greatest artistic work, and Blake too, had, and I think it's something that we translated through to Rossetti. I'm sure he talks at one point about the importance of the first line in terms of sketching, not writing lines, but in terms of sketching. He seemed to have Rossetti notes in the way that when he writes that second part to Gilchrist's biography. That he can trace a particular process of illustration where he does a light, delicate line first and then goes over it more boldly and then very methodically creates the color on top of it. So he's actually looking as an artist about how he works, but he notes in it, Rossetti notes in it, that for Blake, the first line, the first impression, that first feeling that went down on the paper is the most important one, is always the most important one. And so I can see that, if you look at Leonardo's sketchbooks, that you might feel the same, as that actually if you've got somebody of that quality, then the very first thing that comes out of them, before it's revised, is going to be the thing ultimately of interest.
It is really lovely as well, seeing that for example, the versions we saw of Death's Door or The Traveller, as opposed to the engraved versions or different versions in the case of Death's Door, the sort of worked up finished versions are beautiful as well, but there's a different quality to that initial sketch, that moment where he gets it and something. And I think, I don't know whether you, Tamsin, or you, Diane, feel the same as artists as well, that there's that kind of brilliant but nightmare thing where you're forever trying to recapture the energy of that initial sketch, the one where you get the concept and you get it on the page, and then you're forever just trying to like work up a version that recaptures that.
I've definitely done roughs that are better than the finished thing.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Diane, for your question. We've got someone else, Colleen Addy. So if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry, have I unmuted? I think I've unmuted.
We can.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks to all of you for the presentation this evening. My question was really, I've got a copy of the latest facsimile of this, and it's fascinating looking at it. I got a Christmas present, and that's how I ended up with it. What I wondered was whether any of you could recommend a good transcript. It's wonderful trying to read Blake's handwriting, but it would be made a little bit easier with a good quality transcript, especially if it had notes that kind of explain the chronology of some of the writing, because I think John and Tamsin, you both mentioned earlier. I'll tell you.
Cool. I'm going to jump in. Colin, I thought it was me initially because my internet's playing up. I think yours might be as well, Colin, but I think I got the gist of what you were asking. So this version I had, which was an Oxfam Books purchase, which is an extraordinary thing. And I don't mean to it's not really comparable to the new facsimile, which, as we said, is this sort of beautiful work of art. This is very much, it's a kind of, it's almost like a sort of, good for its day. I think 1973 this was published, but it's a kind of photo of each page, and then Erdman and there's another guy involved, I can't remember his name, Donald K. Moore, have literally let me find a good example, because so they've annotated each page, including everything that's kind of crossed out and tried to work out what everything says. So this is quite good. I don't know whether you can see that, but it's just, I mean, they're almost like works of art in themselves. They're annotated pages because they're all coming out at all angles. And so if you really want to get into what it all says, I don't know if there have been other editions that are more like this since. I don't know. This is just the one that I stumbled across, but it is an extraordinary thing. And I've been sort of looking at both copies together, the new beautiful facsimile and the sort of old, in a sense, more sort of useful one in terms of figuring out what everything actually says together, and they nicely sort of illuminate each other, if you like.
Thank you, Colin, for your question. I think, yes, we don't have more time for questions, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank you, Tamsin and John, again for such a brilliant talk. it has clearly raised a number of very interesting questions, and it's always great to see new facsimiles coming up, especially a notebook, because it brings us closer to the man and to the unfolding of his creative process. I'm so glad that the notebook was saved from Frederick Tatum bonfire. It was saved twice because apparently there was also a bonfire on in some of our families somehow. So please.
So Camilla,
Yeah.
Kerry pointed out in the notes that I may be wrong about Tatum. I may be doing him a disservice. It could be John Lennell propaganda. So we might need to investigate.
Well, they may still turn up. That would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So yes, definitely. And please consider joining the Blake Society if you're not a member yet. And subscribe, please, to our newsletter at blakesociety.org. And thank you all for showing up tonight, and see you again, hopefully very soon.
Thank you.